Ticket agent blocks Big Shaq's daughter at the yacht. No entry, no reason. Until the CEO father shows up. And the man holding the clipboard realizes he's not holding the power. This isn't just a scene, it's a reckoning. Because when Legacy walks in, silence has to answer. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The sun came up clean that morning, pouring gold over the marina like it was blessing the day before it began. The wind carried salt and silence, the kind of silence that doesn't sting until it settles in your bones. Boats bobbed in their berths like they knew they were about to be admired. White sails folded like swans at rest. The scene was polished, luxurious, and ready for the charity yacht gala that would draw the city's wealthy and the silently watching press. No chaos, no threat, just sunlight, style, and the illusion of grace. Into that morning walked Shaquille O'Neal. 17, tall with that grounded kind of poise you don't fake. She wore a slate blue dress that swayed like ocean mist, sneakers that said she wasn't trying to impress anyone, and a calmness that came from her father. Her last name carried weight, but that wasn't what she led with. She didn't arrive with an entourage, just a folded invitation, and the steady rhythm of someone used to being watched and underestimated. The man at the check-in desk, Trent Holloway, wore mirrored sunglasses, and the smugness of someone who'd never been told no. He glanced at Tahira once, didn't smile, and asked for her name. She gave it, clear and calm, even as the line behind her started growing with people holding the same cream-colored invitation. Trent looked down at the guest list, scanned for a name he already knew would be there, and paused. He tapped the list again, more for show than for clarity. Doesn't seem to be here, he said, voice light but distant, like he'd already moved on from her. Tahira didn't flinch. She unfolded her invitation and held it toward him with an open hand. Her expression was measured, polite but unmoved, like she'd rehearsed this kind of exchange more times than she cared to admit. He took it reluctantly, glanced at the embossed gold letters, and didn't really read it. Trent leaned back and spoke just loud enough for those nearby to catch pieces. Looks like there's been a mix-up. This invite doesn't cover boarding today. Might be a duplicate from one of the earlier draws. Do you know someone on the crew? The language was slick, but the meaning was raw. He didn't see a guest. He saw a mistake. Tahira's hand stayed by her side. Her jaw tightened, just slightly. She asked him to check again. He nodded, as if humoring her, then tapped the list once more, slower this time, eyes dancing with the pretense of authority. It was a ritual of dismissal, the subtle erasure done with a clipboard, not a weapon. Around her, other guests passed through, women in silk, men in polished loafers. Smiles exchanged between those who knew the right names. None of them stopped. A few noticed the delay, a few raised eyebrows, but nobody said a word. Trent leaned closer, not whispering but shrinking the distance like it would soften the blow. Sorry, miss. We just don't have you in the system. You understand, right? These things happen. They don't, though. Not like this. Tahira felt the flush crawl up her neck. Not because she was ashamed, but because she knew this script. It was a rerun, dressed in different clothes. The calm voice, the fake sympathy, the invitation to walk away quietly. The part that always hurt the most wasn't the words. It was the eyes. Trent's eyes didn't see her. Not as a guest, not as Shaq's daughter, not even as a human deserving courtesy. They saw a disruption, a challenge, a name he'd rather ignore. And still she didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. She just stood there, rooted, like a tree in a place they tried to clear. Trent looked at her again, this time without the sunglasses. His eyes were gray and empty, but behind them a flicker of something less polished. Recognition, maybe. A twitch in the jaw, a barely there clench in the fist. Her last name had just landed in his memory. He almost said something. Almost. Then he smirked, as if to reassert control.
Oh,
That O'Neal. Right. And with that he dismissed her again, with a glance, not a gesture. He looked back at the line behind her, at the richer conversations waiting to happen. But Tahira didn't leave. She didn't step aside or lower her eyes. She stayed. The air thickened. The moment stretched. A woman in a champagne-colored dress whispered to her husband. A man in a branded blazer took out his phone and pretended not to record. Across the marina, the wind shifted, and a gull screamed, a sharp, piercing note in the otherwise curated quiet. The gala hadn't started yet, but the story had. This wasn't about a ticket. This was about presence, about being denied not just a place on a boat, but the assumption of belonging, about how racism doesn't need slurs or fists, just a clipboard, a smile, and an audience willing to look the other way. Tahira took a step back, not in retreat, but in stance. She pulled out her phone, not to record, not to call, just to hold it, waiting. Her silence was louder than any protest, her stillness, more unsettling than any shout. Trent cleared his throat. He turned away from her and gestured to the next guest in line. Next. A pause. And then just before the next person stepped forward, a ringtone echoed. Sharp, custom, unmistakable. Trent looked down at his phone. The name on the screen froze him. Shaquille O'Neal. His finger hovered over the decline button. Then over answer. Then back again. The moment cracked like glass under pressure. Tahira didn't move. She didn't need to. The tide was already turning. And as the morning sun stretched longer over the docks, the quiet wasn't so clean anymore. It carried weight now. Something unseen, but very much felt, like the storm before the reckoning. She stood, waiting, and the wind wrapped around her like a promise. The first promise of many. The sky was wide open that morning, the kind of blue that made you forget storms ever happened. The marina had been scrubbed and staged, the surfaces polished, the banners returned, though they now looked different, not in color or print, but in weight. Nothing had changed physically, but everything felt reshaped. The dock no longer echoed with whispers or discomfort. It was quiet, purposeful, like the air had learned to hold truth better than shame. And there she was. Tahira O'Neal, walking down the same dock where she'd once stood, still dignified, denied. Today she returned not escorted by her father, not flanked by security or PR handlers, but by children, bright-eyed, wide-grinned, high-top-wearing children from the very youth center where Shaq had been the day. Everything unraveled. She moved with them like an older sister, not a celebrity's daughter. She was present, steady, and rooted in something far deeper than vindication. Each of them clutched their own invitation, printed new, not as pity, but as participation. They had been invited not to fill space, but to own it. The yacht gleamed at the end of the dock, not a symbol of luxury now, but of reclamation. The same polished rails, the same silk-covered tables, the same deck where she was once unwelcome. But today it wasn't about whether she belonged. It was about what she brought with her. Tahir helped a boy named Miles step over the gangplank. He had never seen a boat this size. His eyes stayed wide as he counted the floors, then asked if it could fly. She laughed not at him, but with him, and told him the sea didn't need wings to carry you forward. One by one, the children boarded. No hesitation, no second glances from staff, no scanning, no scrutiny. Just space being made the way it always should have been. Shaq watched from a few yards back on the dock, arms folded, heart full. He wasn't dressed for a gala. No suit, no tie, just his old varsity jacket from college. The sleeves faded, the logo half peeled, but the weight of it timeless. He stood next to Lucille, his mother, who had flown in quietly the night before. She wore a wide-brimmed white hat and sensible shoes, her hands folded over her purse, her face unreadable but deeply present. The two of them didn't speak for a while. They just watched. Watched Tahira lift a girl onto the second deck. Watched the staff greet the children like guests, instead of obligations. Watched a world that had tried to shrink her now stand wide enough for her to carry others through it. Finally, Lucille spoke. "She's got your stillness." Shaq turned, brow raised. "She moves like you used to, when people expected you to shout," she added. "But you didn't. You just stood there. Let them trip over their own noise." Shaq nodded, smiling softly. "You taught me that." Lucille's eyes didn't leave the boat. "I taught you to survive. You figured out how to lead." On the deck above, Tahira waved. Shaq raised a hand in return. The moment didn't need words. It carried its own silence. Reporters were nearby but stayed at a respectful distance. There were no flashbulbs, no barked questions. The statement had already been made. This wasn't about headlines anymore. It was about legacy. The captain announced departure. The gangway was pulled in. The horn gave a low, steady call that sounded like breath returning to a chest that had held it too long. And the yacht began to move. The children pressed their hands to the rails, faces turned to the wind, their shouts of wonder echoing out over the water. Some danced, some leaned over to feel the spray. A few sat quietly, just watching the city grow smaller behind them. Tahira stood among them, eyes on the horizon, hands resting on the shoulders of the future. Back on the dock, Shaq didn't follow. He stayed rooted, because his work wasn't on the yacht. It was here on solid ground, where too many still fell through the cracks. Lucille turned to him, her voice low but firm. "You know what I told you when you were young?" Shaq nodded, but she said it anyway. "Your strength isn't your size, it's your stillness when others expect the storm." His eyes glinted, not with tears, but memory. "I remember," he said. They stood together as the boat disappeared toward the open sea, its white trail slicing across the blue, like a signature on possibility. Later that afternoon, a plaque was quietly installed at the entrance to the marina. No ceremony, no ribbon, just 4 lines, etched into brushed bronze. "In honor of those who were once turned away. May your names always be seen. May your presence never be questioned. May the dock always welcome you home." That night, the press tried to keep the conversation going. Some commentators praised Shaq's leadership, others questioned the sustainability of his new programs. There were debates, think pieces, tweets both angry and grateful. But Shaq didn't join the conversation. He didn't need to. The work had already begun. In HR offices. In bias training sessions. In quiet one-on-ones where middle managers asked their black colleagues how many times they'd been Tahira Ed, and never said a word. In classrooms where teachers brought up the story, not as drama, but as a discussion. In homes where children now knew that dignity was not earned through wealth or fame, but demanded through truth. Trent Holloway had submitted his resignation 2 days later. Shaq didn't accept it. Instead, he reassigned him, not to another marina, to a community partnership program. Full-time, with no title, no assistant, and no PR buffer. Trent would sit across from the very people his father once worked to keep out, and listen, not to defend, to learn. It wasn't punishment. It was process. Tahira, for her part, didn't return to the marina often. She had other places to be, schools to speak at, programs to help build, quiet mentoring to do, but she never once mentioned that day again, not publicly, because she didn't need to. The world had heard her the first time, and somewhere along the waterline of that long summer day, something greater than reputation had been launched.
It wasn't just a yacht.
It was a movement, quiet, steady, and impossible to turn around. If this story made you pause, good. Keep that pause. Take it to your boardroom, your classroom, your dinner table. Change doesn't start when the cameras roll. It starts when the comfortable go quiet and still choose to stay. Next time you see the gate, be the one who opens it. Not for applause, but because it's time. There are moments when time does not slow, but sharpens every second clean, every breath weighted. This was one of them. The sun kept rising over the marina, crisp and brilliant, but it no longer felt warm. It felt surgical. Everything gleamed too bright, like a showroom pretending to be a harbor. Trent Holloway, in his pressed polo and expensive smirk, wasn't done. The moment he saw Shaquille O'Neal still standing there, calm and unyielding, something inside him decided this was about principle. He tapped at the list again like it held more power than it did, pretending it was a barrier rather than a flimsy printout. The name was there, clearly typed, but he skimmed past it like it didn't count. "Must be a registration glitch," he said, the corners of his mouth twitching with feigned regret. "Sometimes people get these invites through unofficial channels. Happens more often than you'd think." His words were dipped in courtesy, but soaked in condescension. He leaned forward on his elbows like he was helping her out, like this was a teachable moment, for the misinformed. He made sure the line behind her heard him too, projecting authority, sprinkling doubt. Tahira held his gaze, but he refused to see her, really see her. She said nothing. Her silence wasn't empty. It was calculated. The kind of silence that builds weight instead of losing it. Trent glanced at her clothes again. Clean, simple, not expensive enough to signal wealth the way he understood it. The kind of outfit that made people like him second-guess status. He couldn't compute dignity without a brand label. He pulled the guest list closer, flipped a page with unnecessary flair, then said, "See? You're not on this copy either. Could be a mistake at the back end. You should contact whoever sent you that invite." It wasn't the words. It was the way he said "you." He drew it out like an accusation, stretched it just enough to turn it from a neutral pronoun to a loaded weapon. Around them, more guests filtered through. A couple walked past holding champagne glasses, though it was barely noon. A young man in deck shoes glanced over and furrowed his brow but kept walking. A woman whispered to her friend, lips just barely moving. The buzz of wealth and comfort continued, like a party about to start, like nothing was wrong. Tahira unfolded the invitation again and held it toward him, calm and clear. "This is my name," she said, her voice low and steady. "You've checked it twice." Trent didn't take it this time. He waved her off. "It's not about the name. It's about confirmation. You understand how these things go. Protocols. Liability. Can't just let anyone walk up and say they belong." Anyone. That word landed like a slap, soft but undeniable. From a few feet away, someone chuckled, dry, awkward. Not loud, but just loud enough. Laughter doesn't have to be cruel to be dangerous. Sometimes it's just complicity, masked as amusement. Tahira didn't flinch. Her eyes didn't narrow. Instead, she shifted her gaze away from Trent and looked past the check-in desk, toward the sea. It glistened in the sunlight, indifferent, wide open. There was a metaphor there, but she didn't chase it. She let it sit, let the silence stretch again. Behind Trent, the event coordinator, a woman in a navy blazer, spotted the disruption but hesitated. She didn't approach. Her glance flicked toward Trent, toward Tahira, then away. Trent turned back to his laptop, typing something meaningless, then closed it as if finalizing a verdict. "I'm sorry," he said. But it wasn't sorry. It was bored. "You'll have to step aside. You're holding up the line." Tahir stepped back, but not in surrender. It was a readjustment, a pivot. She wasn't moving away. She was repositioning herself. She pulled out her phone slowly, calmly, and checked the time. She wasn't calling anyone. She was reminding herself that the world was still turning, that the moment would not define her, even if it scarred. That's when the sound came sharp and clear, a buzzing ringtone. Trent's phone vibrated on the corner of the desk. He looked at the screen. Froze. Shaquille O'Neal. The name pulsed like a warning beacon. His fingers twitched. He didn't answer. He didn't decline. He just stared. Then came the smirk. It arrived slowly, crawling across his face like it thought it belonged there. "Oh," he said under his breath, the word curling like smoke. "That's not reverent. Not respectful. Just a notch of recognition, tinged with cynicism." He tapped the screen and let the call pass, turned his phone face down. He looked back at Tahira, who hadn't moved. If anything, she looked more grounded now. The wind picked up a little, tossing a strand of her hair across her shoulder, but her face stayed calm. "You can wait here if you want," Trent said with a shrug. "But I can't guarantee anything's going to change. Rules are rules." And with that, he turned to the next person in line, a man with slicked back hair and a yacht club pin on his lapel. Trent greeted him with cheer, handshake ready, eyes gleaming like the issue behind him had been erased. But the man hesitated, glanced sideways at Tahira. His smile didn't land. Something about the air had shifted. Subtle, but present. Tahira didn't react. She let them all play their parts. She folded her invitation carefully, placed it back in her clutch, and remained where she was, not blocking anyone, not saying a word, just existing in the space she was told she didn't belong in. And people noticed. A woman nearby fidgeted with her bracelet, casting side glances like she was weighing the cost of involvement. An older man muttered to his wife, who shook her head. Another staff member, a younger intern, whispered to a colleague, but didn't move. The silence around her deepened, not because it was empty, but because it was too full, full of choices being made, voices being swallowed, eyes choosing where to land. Trent pretended not to feel the tension. He adjusted his sunglasses and reset his stance, but a crack had formed. It wasn't loud, but it was there. He hadn't just refused entry to someone. He'd made her visible in a way that could not be undone. Tahira stood there, quiet but undeniable, like a question the room wasn't ready to answer. And the ocean kept shining, wide and waiting. In another part of the city, where manicured sidewalks met cracked basketball courts, and new murals fought daily against the ghosts of old graffiti, Shaquille O'Neal was doing what he loved most, showing up for the kids who didn't always get shown to. The rec center gym echoed with laughter, the bounce of basketballs, and the steady rustle of folding chairs being arranged for a scholarship award ceremony. He was surrounded by students in mismatched sneakers and borrowed ties, their hands clutching printed certificates like they weighed more than gold. He'd seen those hands before, the grip that said, "Don't let anyone take this from me." Shaq wore a navy blue suit with the top button undone. No tie. Not for show. For comfort. For connection. His smile wasn't polished. It was real. He leaned in when he talked, met each kid's eyes like they mattered, because to him, they did. His hands moved with ease, as he handed out scholarships under the banner of the Lucille Initiative, named after his mother. The applause was warm, the speeches heartfelt, but somewhere beneath the surface of his steady presence, there was something else, something quietly stirring. It began with the call. His phone buzzed once in his pocket. Nothing out of the ordinary. He ignored it at first, focused on the kid in front of him, a 17-year-old named Ruben, who'd just won a grant to study engineering at LSU. They bumped fists, took the photo, but when the buzzing came again, followed by a brief vibration signaling a voicemail, Shaq's gut twisted in a way he couldn't name. He stepped aside for a moment and checked the screen. Tahira. He listened to the message with one foot still planted in the gym, but his mind had already crossed the city. Her voice was calm, too calm. That kind of stillness only came when you were holding something back. In between the lines of her carefully chosen words, he heard it, the edge of a tremble, the way her breath paused before saying the words, "They said I wasn't on the list." Shaq didn't need details. He didn't ask who they were. He already knew. He walked back into the gym, but the world felt different now, duller at the edges. The color had bled out a little. He made a quiet apology to the center director, took one more picture, and then left through the back door without the usual fanfare. His driver met him outside. The windows were tinted, but not enough to block the sound of his silence. He didn't speak for the first 5 minutes of the ride. He stared ahead, not at traffic, but through it. Memory was creeping back in. It was the smell of paperwork that hit him first. Musty manila folders, the linoleum floor of a downtown bank branch in Newark. He was 11. His mother, Lucille, sat in front of a loan officer in a gray suit, her pressed blouse damp with July heat. She had a flawless credit score. She had savings. She had documentation. But the man on the other side of the desk kept flipping through her file like he couldn't find what he needed. And when he finally stopped, he smiled the way people smile when they're trying to be polite about a no. "We're afraid the application doesn't meet internal standards," he'd said. Shaq remembered how his mother's back stayed straight, how her lips pressed together, but she didn't argue. She gathered her papers, said thank you, and walked him out. That night she made boxed macaroni for dinner, and let the television run loud. She didn't say a word about the bank. But Shaq never forgot. That moment became a root, a quiet fire that grew under everything he built. The next day he'd started walking with his shoulders back, not because he was tall, but because he'd learned something about dignity. Not the kind you're given, the kind you carry alone. That day he'd made himself a promise. They will never humiliate my family again. But sitting in the back seat of that black SUV now, decades later, Shaq realized that no vow could protect someone from being seen the wrong way. Tahira was smart, proud, and solid, but she was still black, still female, still young, and still seen as other when it mattered most. He clenched his jaw, then released it slowly. The driver glanced at him through the rearview mirror but said nothing. As they neared the marina, Shaq asked the driver to take the long way around. He didn't want to arrive too fast. He needed to think. He needed to feel. What hurt most wasn't the disrespect. It was how predictable it was. The gala was a charity event. A place where the wealthy pretended to solve problems they barely understood, where checks were written in ballrooms, but bias still lingered on the docks. He'd been invited to the event. Of course, his name was printed in gold on the promotional flyers. His donation had helped cover half the yacht's refurbishment. But it didn't matter. It never mattered. Not when someone at the gate decided who looked like they belonged. And now, his daughter stood on the other side of that decision. Not for the first time, but for the last time if he had anything to say about it. As the vehicle pulled up along the edge of the marina, Shaq leaned forward. Through the windshield, he could already see the crowd, the flutter of linen, the shine of sunglasses, the glint of money trying to look effortless. Then he saw her, Tahira, still standing, still composed, still waiting, not crumbling, not begging, just there, the way his mother had once been. His heart did something he hadn't felt in years. It broke and steeled itself at the same time. He looked at his reflection in the window, his face older now, his eyes heavier but still carrying that fire, and then he did something he hadn't done in a long time. He smiled. Not because it was funny. Not because it was polite. Because sometimes, when the past repeats itself, you don't scream, you sharpen. He opened the door and stepped out. The weight of the moment followed him like shadow. There was no need for a suit adjustment or a planned line. He wasn't a public figure today. He was a father, a son, a man walking into familiar waters. But this time, with power, with history, and with something to prove. As the crowd parted, and the marina shimmered under the unforgiving sun, Shaq walked forward, tall, silent, steady. He wasn't coming to make a scene. He was coming to rewrite one. He walked slowly, with the weight of someone who had been underestimated before, but no longer felt the need to explain himself. In his stride was history, not just personal but generational. The kind of presence that didn't demand attention but made the absence of respect impossible. Heads turned, eyes darted, whispers flickered through the crowd like sparks in dry grass. Shaq didn't break stride. He wasn't there for spectacle, but spectacle followed him. The white linen pastel cardigans and curated laughter of the yacht crowd felt like stage props now, flimsy against the gravity of who he was and why he had come. He wasn't dressed to impress. No blazer, no showy wealth, just a slate gray polo tucked into crisp slacks and that immovable calm in his walk. It was the look of someone who didn't need to raise his voice, because the truth walked ahead of him. People began to move aside without thinking, parting like glass doors at the entrance to a building they no longer belonged in. No one dared block him. The ones who had smiled smugly at Tahira earlier were now silent, clutching their drinks with nervous hands, pretending to check their phones. Trent Holloway was still at the check-in table, pretending to type something into the laptop that had already been closed twice. He hadn't seen Shaq arrive yet, not fully, but the tension in the air was different now. Dense. Expectant. He looked up when he felt the weight of 100 people watching him, then followed their gaze. And then he saw him. Trent's body stiffened the way people do when they realize a mistake too late. His mouth opened slightly, not enough to speak, just enough to let the panic breathe out. The smirk he'd worn earlier was gone, replaced by the tight-lipped neutrality of someone trying to remember the company policy for handling VIPs, and also wondering how long they'd be employed. Shaq walked straight toward Tahira, who still stood at the side of the table, arms folded, her stance unchanged. But the moment her father appeared, something in her shifted. Not relief, not rescue, just a quiet centering, like the final piece of a locked door had clicked into place. Shaq reached her without saying a word. He looked at her first, not Trent, just a long look between father and daughter. She gave the smallest nod, that was all he needed. Then he turned to Trent, and he smiled. Not the smile you give a friend, or a fan, or someone who deserves grace. This one was surgical. The kind that doesn't show teeth because it's too precise for that. The kind that says, you've already lost, you just haven't figured out how yet. Trent tried to recover, but his words fell into his throat, and didn't return. He gave a shaky half-smile of his own, then tried to stand up straighter, like posture could undo what had already happened. Shaq didn't raise his voice. He didn't lean in or crowd the space. He simply asked, calm as the sea behind him, why did you stop my daughter? The question wasn't loud, but it was seismic. People nearby stopped pretending to chat, and leaned ever so slightly closer. The wind moved again, and the dock creaked under the weight of collective silence. Trent blinked. Twice. His lips moved before sound came out. Sir, there must have been a misunderstanding with the list. I wasn't informed that Shaq raised one hand. Not to silence him, just to pause the lie before it gained speed. He looked around the marina then. Not for effect. For witnesses. Her name was on the list, he said, voice low, even. You looked at it. You saw it. But you told her it wasn't enough. Trent swallowed. I didn't know. Shaq cut in gently. Didn't know what? There it was. The air turned colder. The question wasn't rhetorical. It demanded an answer. And there were only two truths. Trent could admit now. Either he didn't know she was my daughter, or he didn't know she had the right to be here. Trent stood frozen in place, grasping for a middle ground that didn't exist. Behind him, the event coordinator finally arrived, her heels clicking across the dock, face pale beneath her foundation. She scanned the scene, assessed the damage, and tried to inject levity. Mr. O'Neal, please, this is all a terrible mix-up. We had a last-minute staffing switch at the desk. Trent didn't have the updated digital list. There's been some confusion. Shaq's eyes never left Trent. There's no confusion. The coordinator hesitated, words failing her in real time. Tahira stepped forward now, just slightly, standing between the two adults, like an anchor holding steady in rough tide. She wasn't crying. She hadn't all day. But her silence had never said more. Shaq placed one hand on her shoulder. Not as comfort, as recognition. This is the kind of moment, he said softly, still speaking to Trent, but letting his voice carry, where people learn who they really are, where we all learn how deep certain habits run. Trent lowered his eyes, but it was too late for shame to be subtle. You didn't stop her because she didn't belong, Shaq continued. You stopped her because you didn't expect her to. That's not a mistake. That's a lens you need to unlearn. The marina, once so loud with affluence and ease, had gone utterly quiet. The soft slap of waves against dock pillars filled the space where nervous excuses used to live. And then Shaq stepped closer to the check-in table. Not in anger. In presence. He lifted the guest list with one hand, glanced at it, and pointed. Tahira O'Neal, row 5, printed in bold. Confirmed. He placed the list back down with surgical calm. This is how erasure starts. With a name you choose not to see. He turned to Tahira again. Let's go. She nodded once, and they walked past Trent, past the stunned coordinator, and past every person who'd watched it all unfold without speaking. And not one of them tried to stop them now. There was no raised voice, no chaos, no slammed fists, just silence, pregnant and pulsing. As Shaquille O'Neal stood beside the check-in table, the guest list still fluttering slightly from where he'd placed it moments ago. Around him, the crowd was still frozen in a moment they couldn't quite name. Some stared at their phones without unlocking them. Others sipped from glasses they forgot to swallow. The marina, a space built for opulence and ease, now felt like a courtroom where no one wanted to admit guilt. Shaq reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He didn't raise it to record, didn't aim it for spectacle. He simply opened the voice memo app and hit record. Not for social media, for clarity, for the permanent archive of truth. Then, without looking at the camera, he began speaking. Not loud, not theatrical, just steady. The kind of voice you use when the facts are too strong to bend. My daughter, he said, was turned away from an event she was formally invited to. Her name was on the list. Confirmed, documented, printed. She was denied entry by one man. He glanced at Trent, who stood off to the side now, hands behind his back, lips drawn into a flat line that couldn't decide whether to be apology or defiance. The crowd watched him like a spotlight had shifted. Suddenly everyone was seeing the man who'd moments ago controlled the gate. Shaq continued, calm and razor sharp. I'm recording this for myself, for anyone who cares to ask how this keeps happening. Because it always starts the same way, denial dressed as professionalism, exclusion hidden behind protocol. The event coordinator, still red in the face, stepped forward with a mess of words in her mouth, eager to end what she had let begin. Mr. O'Neal, we deeply regret this doesn't reflect the values of our organization. Trent was not authorized. Shaq cut in with a turn of the head. I didn't ask for an apology. I asked for answers. That was the pivot. Every person nearby felt the shift. This wasn't about a personal slight anymore. It was an inquiry, a dissection of something deeper. He turned fully toward Trent. Not aggressive, just surgical. Why was Tahira the only one turned away? Trent opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked at the coordinator, but no lifeline came. He tried to soften the truth with language. There was uncertainty about her registration. She wasn't accompanied by a guest. She didn't have credentials visible. Credentials? Shaq's voice sharpened just slightly. You asked for none from anyone else. I've been watching since I got here. No wristbands. No badges. Just assumptions. Trent's eyes flicked to the crowd, looking for a way out that didn't involve admitting what he'd done. Shaq pressed on. Why did your tone shift the moment you recognized her last name? Another pause. Another breathless beat. Trent shifted his weight. I may have misunderstood the protocol. Once I realized who she was, you suddenly became courteous, Shaq said. But not before you tried to erase her. Not before you made her stand there, alone, for 15 minutes, as guests walked past and judged her. The words weren't shouted, but they landed like thunder. And why, Shaq asked, did the apologies only begin after I arrived? There it was. The final knife. The uncomfortable, undeniable truth that in the hierarchy of respect, the only reason anyone cared was because a 7-foot multi-millionaire black man had walked into the room, not because a young black girl had been disrespected, but because he made it inconvenient to continue ignoring it. No one responded. Because no one could. Shaq turned his phone off, ending the recording. The silence afterward wasn't relief. It was exposure. Every person who had smiled at Tahira after Shaq's arrival now had to ask themselves why they hadn't said a word before it. But the story didn't end there. A woman in the crowd, older, blonde, probably mid-50s with a name no one remembered, stepped forward. Her voice trembled just enough to suggest she wished it didn't. "Mr. O'Neal," she said, "I think you should know, this isn't the first time Trent's done this." Now the attention pivoted again. Shaq looked at her, measured. "Go on." The woman hesitated. Then continued. "Last year during a fundraiser for inner-city education programs, he redirected a group of young black students to the back gate, said they needed additional screening, claimed it was for security purposes. I didn't speak up. I should have." Shaq didn't nod, didn't say thank you, just listened. The cracks in the surface were showing now. Someone else, a man in a navy sports coat, added from the edge, "I thought he was being harsh, but I didn't know it was racial. I didn't want to assume." "That's how it stays buried," Shaq replied without turning. "Everyone sees it, no one calls it." Then the deeper root surfaced, not through words, but through whispers. One of the younger Marina staff members leaned toward another and said, "Just loud enough. His dad used to run this place, back in the day, that's where he learned all this." The line hit the air like oil on water. Shaq turned slowly toward Trent again. "Is that true?" Trent didn't answer. He didn't have to. The memory came to Shaq uninvited, sharp and vivid. Lucille, his mother sitting on a folding chair across from a real estate agent who refused to sell to her. The man had smiled, worn a red tie, and told her the home had just gone off the market. It hadn't. That man's name? Franklin Holloway. Now decades later his son stood in front of Shaq's daughter, repeating the same legacy, refined, rebranded, but no less damaging. "You inherited more than property," Shaq said. "You inherited a script, one you never stopped performing." Trent looked gutted now, unsure whether to stand tall or collapse. But Shaq didn't flinch. He didn't offer sympathy. He offered clarity. "I'm not here to make a scene. I'm here because my daughter deserves to know that her dignity is not a question mark." He turned to Tahira, his voice softer now. "You didn't imagine this. You didn't overreact. You weren't almost disrespected. You were." Tahira nodded, jaw set, eyes unblinking. She had never needed her father to fight her battles. But his presence, his precision, gave her the space to know she wasn't wrong for simply existing. The coordinator, flustered and sweating now, stepped forward again, her apology rehearsed but sincere. "Mr. O'Neal, we'll be launching a formal investigation." Shaq raised a hand. "Don't investigate. Transform. Change the culture. Not just here. Everywhere this kind of behavior is normalized." She nodded quickly. But everyone knew transformation didn't come from nods. It came from being uncomfortable, and staying in that discomfort until something broke. As Shaq and Tahira walked away, past the yacht, past the guest list, past the people too slow to intervene, there was no music playing, just footsteps, just waves, just history still echoing in the sun. Some stories are buried for a reason, but some graves don't stay closed forever. Shaquille O'Neal stood there without raising a hand, and yet the entire marina had come to heel. He didn't have to remind them who he was. His presence did that. But what came next wasn't fame. It was ownership. That's when it happened. The sound of new footsteps measured, confident, echoing sharply across the dock's polished planks. The event coordinator, still shaken, and clinging to her clipboard like it might shield her, turned toward the sound and froze. So did Trent. He had just begun to breathe again, when he saw the man approaching. A second Shaquille? No. The same man, but walking now with a different purpose. Shaq didn't stop near the check-in table. He didn't look for validation. He passed by the branded banners, the champagne buckets, the scripted evening schedule taped behind the welcome desk. Instead, he walked straight into the heart of the marina office building and emerged through the side balcony. The place that had been locked to most, shielded behind smoked glass, now wide open. And from his hand he held a small black folder, not symbolic, legal. He laid it flat on the event coordinator's table and tapped it once. Not with anger, with finality. "I'm not just a guest," he said, his voice low, commanding. "I'm the majority shareholder." The pause that followed stretched wider than the harbor. People looked at one another, confused, impressed, nervous, but Trent collapsed inward. Not physically, not in any dramatic, overt way, but in the way a man folds when he realizes every assumption he made was wrong. For years, Shaq had been investing quietly, deliberately, into the infrastructure of this city's waterfront. Not to own it, not for image, but because he understood what power could protect when it wasn't flaunted. He had purchased his shares through shell corporations, advisors and trusts. And now, as the final signatures were processed 2 weeks earlier, he became the CEO of the parent company that owned this marina. His name wasn't on the dock signs, but it was on the deed. And that changed everything. The coordinator swallowed hard. "Mr. O'Neal." Shaq waved her off, gently but firmly. His eyes were on Trent now, the man who had denied his daughter the right to be seen. Trent stood stiff, hands now at his sides. His lips parted like he might apologize again, but something in him knew better. Apologies weren't currency anymore. They wouldn't buy his way out. "I'm not firing you," Shaq said, voice even. "Yet." The word "yet" landed like a warning shot. "I could," he continued. "No one here would question it. No one would stop me. But I don't want your silence. I want your truth." And then he did something unexpected. Shaq picked up a microphone from the podium nearby, the one meant for auction bids and foundation speeches. He held it for a beat. Then he walked toward Trent, extended it toward him like a blade, and said, "Explain yourself. Not to me, to her." And there she was, Tahira O'Neal, still standing, where she had always been. Still grounded, but now the light had shifted. Now the platform was hers. The daughter who had been denied entry was now the focal point of an audience that hadn't earned her voice. Trent hesitated. He took the mic with both hands like it might break. The crowd turned toward him, and for the first time his power melted. He cleared his throat. "Tahira," he began, her name heavy with discomfort. "I didn't mean to. I didn't realize." His voice cracked. He tried again. "I assumed things I shouldn't have. About who you were. About whether you belonged. I've been doing this job for a while, and I've made decisions before. Quick ones. Snaps. But today," he trailed off, searching. No one helped him find the word. "I saw someone confident, alone, no badge, no entourage. I didn't stop to think why I saw that as suspicious. I just reacted." Shaq watched him with no expression. The mic in Trent's hands shook slightly. "I've grown up with certain ways of seeing the world. From my father, from my mentors. I thought I'd outgrown them. But clearly, I haven't. And for that I'm sorry. It wasn't clean. It wasn't redemptive. But it was real." And now all eyes shifted to Tahira. She stepped forward. No mic. No speech prepared. Just present. She looked at Trent for one long steady moment. Not out of hate, but out of reckoning. Then she said, "What you said today didn't just hurt. It exposed what people like me are always told to ignore. It told me I needed to explain myself to exist." The words dropped like stones into the still water of the marina. "But I won't explain myself. Not today. Not ever again." Then she turned, not dramatically, but firmly, and walked toward her father. Shaq watched her with a kind of pride that couldn't be spoken. It lived in the way he stepped aside to let her pass. In the way he nodded once, not to affirm her words, but to say, "I saw what you carried, and you didn't let it break you." Trent lowered the mic. The event coordinator looked at him, unsure whether she needed to escort him off the dock or let him fade into the background. But that didn't matter anymore, because this wasn't just a moment. It was a shift. There are moments that aren't scheduled on programs or printed on glossy brochures. Moments that don't arrive with introductions or a signal from the sound team. They just happen, raw, quiet at first, and then seismic. This was one of those moments. Not planned, not polished, just real. The crowd at the marina stood caught between anticipation and discomfort, eyes flicking between Tahira O'Neal and the microphone she had not asked for. But it waited for her, like the silence had created space only she could fill. She hadn't demanded it. She had earned it with her stillness, with her restraint, with the truth of simply not walking away. No one invited her to speak. No one needed to. Shaq stood to her side, his posture unmoving, his presence unmistakable. But he didn't lean in. He didn't take her hand. He didn't guide her forward. Because she wasn't stepping into his legacy. She was building her own. Tahira stepped up to the mic. No notes. No speech card. Just breath, resolve, and the weight of all the days that had led here. Her voice, when it came, was steady. Not loud. Not fragile. Just full. I wasn't surprised, she began, eyes scanning the faces in front of her, when I was told I didn't belong. A small ripple moved through the audience. Not reaction, realization. She let that line sit for a moment, then continued. Because I've been told that before. Not always with words, usually with glances, with hesitation, with that pause between checking my name and deciding it's not enough. It happens in classrooms, where I'm the only one asked to show my ID when everyone else gets a smile. It happens in stores, where a sensor beeps and I'm the only one asked to open my bag. It happens at airports, where I'm randomly selected every other flight. She didn't flinch. She didn't perform. She just spoke. And it happened here, on a dock lined with yachts, under banners that say community and charity, but where I was asked to justify why I was standing where I stood. A woman near the back, dressed in crisp white linen, put a hand to her mouth. Her friend touched her arm, but neither of them spoke. Their eyes didn't leave Tahir. She continued, voice unwavering.
I was given an invitation. My name was on the list. But that didn't protect me, because people like me, young, black, female, are never just accepted on entry. We're measured, scanned, doubted, and then maybe tolerated. But welcomed, she shook her head once. That's rare.
A man with slicked back hair and a heavy watch turned, quietly stepped away from the crowd, and disappeared behind one of the cocktail tables. He didn't want to hear this part. Or maybe he couldn't. I've been told to stay quiet before. Told not to make it about race. Told I'm lucky. Told I'm privileged. Told I should be grateful. And maybe I am. I'm grateful for my father, for my education, for the platforms I've had. But none of that erases what I live through every day. My success doesn't cancel out your bias. Now, even the wind stilled. The flags above the yachts hung limp, as if they too were listening. I'm not angry, she said, her tone never rising. I'm tired. And with that, something cracked, not in her but in the audience. A truth too long buried had surfaced without permission, and it wasn't going back under. Trent, standing just a few paces behind her, didn't move. His arms stayed crossed, but his face was pale. He tried to meet her eyes once, but couldn't hold the gaze, because nothing she said was untrue. It was just unflinching. I didn't need a camera to prove this happened. I didn't need to go viral or get sympathy online. I didn't come here for justice. I came for a gala. But the second I walked up to that table, I stopped being a guest. I became a problem. Her fingers gripped the edge of the podium now, not from nerves, but from anchoring herself. Not because she was sinking, but because she was about to rise. I want to make something clear, she said. I'm not speaking today because I want to shame anyone. I'm speaking because I want to remind everyone that silence is not neutrality. Silence is permission. The marina had grown colder in spirit, warmer in truth. The people gathered now knew they were no longer at a yacht event. They were witnessing a reckoning, disguised as a girl, with poise and the kind of composure grown adults fail to carry. Tahira took a breath. Her voice dropped slightly. This wasn't about me. Not really. I'm not the only one this has happened to. I'm just the one who had the right last name to make people care. Shaq's eyes didn't leave her once. His arms were folded, but it wasn't defense. It was pride held tight. I have friends who would have walked away when it got uncomfortable. I have friends who've been told worse, louder, with more malice and less witnesses. Some of them never speak about it. Some of them carry it until it rots inside. I won't do that. She stepped back from the mic. Just one step. Then she paused. Trent, she said, not bitter, not soft, just clear. I don't want your apology. I want your change. I want you to remember this moment. The next time someone who doesn't look like you walks up with the right to be where they are. A gasp rippled somewhere in the middle row. Then she turned, not dramatically, not for applause. She walked back to her father. No tears, no breakdown, no collapse, just the dignity that had been denied her now displayed in full view. Shaq met her halfway. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. Because the loudest thing in that marina was the truth that had just been spoken. And the silence that followed wasn't ignorance anymore. It was accountability. By 10 a.m., a press conference had been scheduled. Not hastily, not theatrically, but with precision. The venue wasn't a hotel ballroom or a boardroom. It was the dock itself, deliberately chosen. The same platform where Shaquille O'Neal had been denied entry now became a stage for accountability. The podium was unadorned, the backdrop simple. No banners, no brands, just bold air and sharpened attention. Shaquille O'Neal stepped forward to speak. No entourage flanked him. No PR handler stood nearby. He wore a black dress shirt, sleeves rolled once, and no jacket. A statement in simplicity. His expression was calm, but something behind his eyes signaled that this wasn't just business. This was a reckoning delivered with clarity instead of fury. The media had shown up. They always did when the headline teased a public correction, especially one involving power. Investors tuned in through live streams. Bloggers clipped every second, but those who knew Shaq knew this wasn't about a performance. This was a correction decades overdue. And it wasn't being whispered behind closed doors. It was being carved into public record. He began without notes. What happened yesterday wasn't unique. That's the problem. His voice was level, deliberate. My daughter wasn't the first to be questioned. She won't be the last. The man who denied her a place didn't invent racism. He inherited it. He absorbed it, normalized it, passed it on like furniture in a house that's never been gutted. And while the world's gotten better at dressing that house up, new coat of paint, some PR in the corner, it's still sitting on a cracked foundation. The crowd was silent, save for the clicks of cameras. I didn't buy into this marina to become a figurehead. I bought it because I know what it feels like to have the door shut in your face while your name is still on the guest list. I bought it to protect the future from repeating my past, but owning the building isn't enough if the rot's still in the walls. He paused for just a beat, not for drama, but to let the truth sink in. So, here's what's going to happen next, he said, and the air tensed. I'm launching a program. Effective immediately. Every business, every branch, every venue under my ownership will undergo comprehensive racial bias education and accountability review. Not once, not as a box to check. Permanently, ongoing. Somewhere off to the side, a man in a tailored gray suit with an earpiece stiffened. An investor, perhaps. One of the many who had quietly benefited from things staying the way they were. Every employee, Shaq continued. From front desk to executive suite. Every hiring manager. Every event planner. Every voice behind a phone. If you carry my brand, you carry the responsibility to see people clearly and to treat them like they belong before they're forced to prove it. He let that sit. And if that makes anyone uncomfortable, good. Discomfort is the first step to change. The statement was bold, but not unexpected. What followed, however, caused more than a few private panic calls behind the scenes. Let me be clear, Shaq said. If your values are rooted in profit over people, if your metrics measure only margins and never the dignity of those impacted by your business, you're in the wrong room. Sell your shares. Leave your seat at the table. I'm not hosting comfort. I'm building correction. It was a line that cut deeper than any accusation. Not because it was angry, but because it was intentional. Phones buzzed. Screens lit up with phrases like O'Neal takes stand and celebrity CEO goes off script. But Shaq wasn't off script. He was rewriting it. A journalist raised a hand. Shaq nodded. Mr. O'Neal, she asked, won't this kind of stance alienate some of your investors? There are murmurs of withdrawals already. People are saying you're politicizing business. Shaq tilted his head slightly, then answered without blinking. If profit comes at the cost of dignity, it's not profit, it's poison. The phrase hit like a thunderclap. It spread before the words had even fully left his mouth. Within minutes it was on Twitter, trending across platforms, printed in white serif on black tiles across Instagram feeds, attached to images of him standing at the dock with the wind in his shirt and the fire in his eyes. It wasn't just a statement. It was a stake. Trent Holloway, Shaq continued, will not be publicly shamed, but he will be held accountable. That starts with reflection, with education, with the choice to grow, and it's not optional. He shifted his tone, not softer but clearer. We don't throw people out for the sin of ignorance, but we don't excuse them either. If you harm someone, you do the work. If you ignore harm, you become part of it. There's no neutral anymore. Not in. The press conference went on for another 10 minutes, with questions answered thoughtfully, but without compromise. The air never softened, the mission never blurred. When it ended, Shaq stepped down, but he didn't leave the dock. He stood at the edge, watching the sea, while a small team cleared the podium. He didn't say much to those who approached. A few people offered support. A few asked for photos. One Marina board member muttered something about bravery, and Shaq responded with a single nod and walked away. That evening, a different kind of conversation took over the internet. It wasn't about cancel culture. It wasn't about political correctness. It was about standards, about what leadership looked like when it wasn't performative. And while some investors did in fact pull out, the ones who stayed, who emailed that night, pledging solidarity, who offered resources, who asked how can we help this become permanent, they were the ones who mattered. Shaq wasn't trying to save face. He was trying to save futures. And beneath the glossy brochures, the billion-dollar smiles, and the staged galas, a different current began to surge. Quieter than protest, deeper than applause, and impossible to stop. The grave sat beneath a thin canopy of cypress trees, tucked at the edge of an old cemetery where the polished tombstones ended and the weather-worn names began. The grass here grew unevenly, untamed in patches, trimmed in others, as if time itself wasn't quite sure whether to care or move on. Trent Holloway stood in front of a stone that didn't glimmer. It didn't invite reverence. It simply was gray, square and honest. Franklin Holloway. 1938. Legacy is built on order. That last line had sounded noble when Trent was a boy. It was engraved by request, chosen by his mother, after the funeral, when the world still wore black, and everything smelled like lilies and distant tears. Back then, legacy felt like something to be proud of, something inherited like a name or a trust fund. But standing there now, alone under the sagging sky, the word order no longer felt neutral. It felt like a weapon, quiet, calculated, and passed down like an heirloom. Trent's hands were deep in his coat pockets, fists clenched not in anger, but in shame. The soil in front of the grave was cracked from a dry season. No flowers, no offerings, just silence. The kind that crept into a man when the excuses had all dried up, and memory was the only thing left to speak. He hadn't planned on coming here. But after the press conference, after the cold edge of Shaq's words settled into his bones, something pulled him off course, not to escape, to confront. For years Trent had believed in what he called structure, rules, procedures, policies. He hadn't named them racism, not aloud. He hadn't worn it like his father had, loud and unapologetic. Franklin Holloway had been a different breed, affable in public, brutal in private, a real estate mogul who built fences, literal and legal, a man who, with a handshake and a loophole, could keep families out of neighborhoods without ever raising his voice. One of those families, Shaq's, had tried to buy a home in the Holloway-backed Rivergate estates back in the late 80s, a modest home, nothing flashy, just safe, just clean, just American. Shaquille O'Neal had been ready to sign. Everything was approved. Credit, job history, background check. But the paperwork had mysteriously stalled. Escrow fell apart. The property was marked withdrawn by seller. What Lucille never knew, but Shaq eventually did, was that Franklin Holloway had intervened. A call, a comment, a suggestion that those kinds of families were better suited elsewhere. Shaq had learned the truth years later, quietly. He never said a word, never sought vengeance. He just remembered, and built. And now, here stood the son of that man, wearing the same last name, haunted by the same legacy. Trent crouched slightly, brushing some fallen leaves from the headstone, like the gesture might redeem something. It didn't. His voice cracked as he spoke, not to the world, but to the dirt beneath him. I didn't know, he said. Not at first, but maybe I did. Maybe I always did. His throat tightened. He swallowed. You told me the world had rules, that people had their place. You said if they didn't like it, they could work harder, be better, blend in. But you didn't mean better. You meant wider, quieter, smaller. He looked down at the cracked soil, and I believed you. The tears didn't fall dramatically. They came quietly, like a leak in the soul finally giving way. Not grief, guilt. I ruined my job. I embarrassed myself. I hurt a girl who was just trying to be part of the world you taught me to filter. He didn't hear the footsteps behind him, just the crunch of gravel under weight, slow, purposeful. He turned and found himself looking into the eyes of the very man his father had tried to keep out. Shaquille O'Neal stood at the edge of the gravesite, arms folded, not angry, not smug, just present. "I figured I might find you here," Shaq said. Trent stood awkwardly, wiping his sleeve across his face, trying to straighten a composure that wouldn't return. "I didn't mean for any of this to go that far," Trent offered, his voice brittle. "I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't think—" Shaq raised a hand, not to silence but to pause. Then he stepped forward, looked at the grave, and read the inscription. "Legacy is built on order," he said quietly. He believed that. Shaq turned to Trent, his tone shifting. Not hard, not soft, just clear. "You've got a choice now," he said. "Stay frozen or grow." Trent exhaled, the weight of those two options knocking the air from his lungs. "You think that's even possible? After what I did?" Shaq didn't blink. "Growth's not for you. It's for the people who come after you. That's the point. You'll still lose business. Still face backlash. You'll still have moments when that voice in your head tells you to look away instead of speak up. But if you care more about change than comfort, yeah, it's possible." Trent looked down. His voice was low. "You knew about him, didn't you? What he did to your mom." "I knew," Shaq said. "I've known for years." "Why didn't you ever say anything?" Shaq stared at the grave again. "Because revenge dies with the person who wanted it. But transformation, that outlives us all." There was no forgiveness speech, no handshake, no dramatic reconciliation. Just a moment, human, exposed, and necessary. Shaq turned to leave, his steps slow but certain. Trent stayed behind, standing between the shadows of the past and the light of a different kind of future. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel entitled to forgiveness. He felt the responsibility to earn it.